Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Edward D. Melillo in support of the Butterfly Effect in conversation this evening with University of Michigan professor Ian Shin. Some Zoom etiquette. You heard me as you joined, but you're muted and you will remain muted. Speaker view is probably going to be the ideal way to experience the event tonight. That way you'll just see whoever is speaking on your screen at any given time. And we do ask that you keep your video off through the duration of the event as well. The chat is closed for public chatting, but you might want to have the chat window open. I'll be there to drop links to where you can purchase the Butterfly Effect from Literati Bookstore. And you can also use the chat to send any questions you might have for the author at any time during the event, and I'll ask some at the conclusion of Edward and Ian's conversation. And as a reminder, you can purchase the book from literatibookstore.com. As I mentioned, I'll drop a link in the chat. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can always find links in the description below. You can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan. And in lieu of a book purchase, we do ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our ongoing virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's subscription or this month's subscription or a subscription for the remainder of the year, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for joining us this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on wherever in the world you may be tuning in from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and our moderator this evening. Edward D. Melillo is professor of history and environmental studies at Amherst College. He is author of Strangers on Familiar Soil, Rediscovering the Chile-California Connection, which won the Western History Association's 2016 Coffee Prize for the most distinguished book on the American West. He was awarded the Mellon New Directions Fellowship in 2017. He received his PhD and his MPhil from Yale University and his BA from Swarthmore College. He grew up in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and now lives in South Hadley. And Ian Shin is assistant professor of history and American culture at the University of Michigan. A social and cultural historian of the United States, Ian focuses in his teaching and research on the history of U.S. foreign relations and Asian American history. He is currently completing his first book, Imperfect Knowledge, Chinese Art and American Power in the Trans-Pacific Progressive Era. His articles and reviews have appeared in the Journal of American East Asian Relations, Journal of Asian American Studies, and Connecticut Historical Review. He received his PhD from Columbia University. Please join me in using your Zoom clap reactions to welcome Ian and Edward into your living rooms.
Well, thank you so much, John. And Ted, welcome virtually to Ann Arbor.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to John and Literati for hosting this tonight.
You know, you and I have known each other for a little while now, and I have to sort of admit up front that I'm, personally have a stake in this conversation because I am an alum of Amherst, and so it's really great to welcome you to our turf at U of M. And perhaps we can start with talking about the book, just to think about your personal connection to this topic, right? This beautifully written, gorgeously illustrated book, which I have with me. You talk about how your introduction to entomology, is decades in the making. So how did you first become interested in the world of insects?
So first of all, I want to thank Ian for doing this. He's an old friend. We met at the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley years ago. And as soon as Amherst was mentioned, we immediately connected and went out for coffee. And since then, we've been close friends. The last time I saw Ian was on the Amherst College campus when he came to give a talk there. Was that a year ago or so?
That's right.
Something like that. And so thanks again for agreeing to do this. And that's a great opening question. My connection to insects really goes back to when I was an 11-year-old. And I took a class at the Woods Hole Children's School of Science in my hometown with a woman named Becky Lash, who's a noted local monarch butterfly expert. And there were a bunch of 11-year-old kids stuck in a hot classroom on a warm day. And Becky brought in a monarch butterfly and she set it on a wedge of watermelon. And it inserted its proboscis into the ripe fruit and began to take a long drink. And I remember thinking, boy, I can really sympathize and understand what that insect is going through right now. I'm pretty thirsty and hot. And it was kind of a moment when I experienced a bit of kinship with another species. And that launched me into this fabulous and fantastic world. Since then, I've had many interactions with insects. Some have been alimentary. I've eaten my share. Others have been more compassionate in nature, but I'll get into those later tonight.
Yes, well, I'm glad you teased that, because we're certainly going to talk about insects as food, and I've got a checklist of all the insects you mentioned in that chapter, and I'm going to run down that list and see how many of those you've tasted, because some of them are pretty gnarly. No, I'm glad you started off with that, because it really is in some ways the kind of central idea of the book, right? The sort of intertwining of the insect and human worlds, and the way that those things just cannot be teased apart. However much we try in the age of synthetics to replace, right, that part of the natural world, they come back again and again and prove to be parts of our world. Maybe another way to think about your coming to this topic is how, in terms of the other work that you've done, right? And John mentioned that you wrote Strangers on Familiar Soil, Rediscovering the Chile-California Connection, how that led you to writing this book, right? Which is in many ways much broader in its reach, and you touch on Japan and obviously North America and Europe. I mean, the book is really international in scope. So tell us a little bit about how you pivoted from your first book to this one.
Sure. It seems like an enormous leap, although for me, many of the through lines and undercurrents are fundamentally there. I've long taught a class. I taught it starting way back in Oberlin, at Oberlin College in 2007, my first teaching job, called Commodities, Nature, and Society, in which the students and I explore the histories of coffee, tea, tobacco, silk, microchips, units of bandwidth, human body parts, and nitrogen in world history. And I always have the students do final projects on a commodity, and they tell their classmates and me about the social and environmental histories of these products that have been traded throughout the world. And a student at Oberlin did a project on shellac. And I'd never thought about the fact that shellac was the main ingredient in 78 RPM records. And those are the records that precede the vinyl era that begins in the 1940s. And so the global transmission of sound prior to about 1942 was fundamentally dependent on an insect secretion. And that really blew my mind, because I'd known about silk. Many of us have interacted with silk, worn it, and seen it in various guises in fashion shows, etc. And I knew about cochineal, which I'll talk about later. For Latin Americanists, it's a mainstay of our studies of Mexico. It's the source of this brilliant red dye, this scarlet dye that was lusted after by Europe's empires to color ecclesiastical vestments and royal robes. But I'd known very little about shellac. But once I had a trio, any historian knows once you've got 3 examples of something, you're good to go. So that's where the project got its start. And it really was out of this class. And much of the work I'd done on commodity histories for my first book, Commodities That Were Traded Between Chile and California, ended up kind of being a through line into this book as I pursued those stories much further, as you said, into the global realm.
One of the things about pursuing it into the global realm is the incredible sort of breadth of sources that you use in this book, and the sort of number of languages that you engage. And I know that you started your career off at Yale as a graduate student in Chinese history, but then you also in this book tackle the sort of lives of insects in all of these other languages. How do you do that kind of research? I know you also used the New Directions Mellon grant to learn Native Hawaiian. And that didn't show up, I don't think, in the book as a language skill, but lots of others did. So how did you manage all of that research in all of those languages?
So one of the things that's a real joy for me as a historian is working with the raw primary source material that has not been worked with by other people or has been translated by others, and I might dispute those translations. And wrestling with and grappling with those sources is really what gives me so much joy and excitement in this profession. And so, as much as possible in the book, I tried to work with those raw materials. And so I'm translating little bits and pieces from lots of languages. I had to dust off my really rusty Chinese. My Spanish is in much better shape, as is my French. And I had a lot of fun translating the journals of the famous bio-pirate Nicholas Joseph Thierry de Menonville, who in 1776 left Paris and snuck into colonial Mexico to steal cochineal insects and the nopal cacti on which they dine from the Spanish Empire, and abscond with them to Saint-Domingue, which would later become Haiti. And I worked with Thierry de Menonville's journals in French and found a number of places where previous scholars had mistranslated words, especially important words. There was one case in which Thierry de Menonville was sneaking out on board a ship leaving Mexico for Saint-Domingue, and the sailors were inquiring what was in his unusual packing cases. And another historian had translated his journal to say that he had packed lint among the ingredients in these cases. And I realized they'd mistranslated the word. It should have been linen. And it made much more sense because he was actually alluding to the Shroud of Turin. And I don't think he'd be referring to Christ's face on lint, rather on linen. So there were all sorts of fun twists and turns that the translation of the primary source materials took. But that's one of the ways in which this book is a really different book than how a journalist or a scientific author might approach this same subject. And I very much enjoy bringing that first person interpretation to these materials.
And I mean, on that note too, in many cases, the book goes well beyond sort of, historical times to think about the present and even about the future. So I'm curious if you felt like, I know that as a historian, when I'm asked to comment on, a current event or to sort of think about how, U.S.-China relations from the early 1900s might have impacted U.S.-China relations now, I'm always very hesitant to kind of forecast or prognosticate. I'm curious, writing this book, where you do talk about a lot of that history, but then you also talk about the kind of contemporary aspect of, how insects are faring in our modern sort of environment and economy. How do you handle putting on your historian hat versus your current events hat versus your fortune teller, future oracle kind of hat?
That's a great question. It's something I'm negotiating all the time because, of course, at Amherst, I teach in both the environmental studies department and the history department. And environmental studies by nature is a very presentist enterprise that's driven by current concerns. And I'm constantly having to straddle that divide. Nervous energy is perhaps the way that I compromise there. I'm often very excited to talk about the present and the future, but I try whenever possible to ground it in my understandings of latent outcomes in the past and the ways that the future is actually being made in the past, and we can see those roots there. And I spend a lot of time working with my students on finding those roots in the past, because often the temptation is not to historicize the present or the future and to simply think of those things in a vacuum. And I try to mitigate that impulse as much as I can. So I guess it's a question of straddling the two halves of my own identity. And I come by it honestly because my father's an ecologist and my mother teaches history and English. So bringing the humanities and the sciences together is maybe much like bringing the past and the present and the future together in these conversations.
Yeah, the book is a perfect reflection of that union. Well, Ted, maybe we can sort of shift to thinking about and talking about some of the chapters in the book. And I want to just tease for folks who are on the call with us that the book is organized into two parts. The first part, entitled Metamorphoses, looks at some of these different insects that you talk about in depth, and you tell the sort of stories of their histories. The second part of the book, Hives of Modernity, looks at the way that insects are involved in different areas of human endeavor: genetic research, pollination of plants, and then in eating, as we'll talk about. So I wonder if maybe we can touch on each of these parts. And I figured that I would start because in the first part of the book, you feature three particular insects that kind of get the spotlight: the shellac bug, the silkworm, and then cochineal, which you've already mentioned in the context of Thierry de Menonville. How did you pick these three, or how did these become the ones that you wanted to talk about? And because you also mentioned sort of the gall ink. I forget was it a beetle?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So how did you decide to write about these three particular insects?
So one of the big stories that really surprised and intrigued me when I was doing the research for this project is that silk, shellac, and cochineal are all ancient commodities that have been produced literally for thousands of years and have long provenances, but yet they've all three made a resurgence in the modern era. And it seemed like after the Second World War, they were all about to disappear, that they were going to be replaced by synthetics produced in the laboratory. Things like nylon for silk and vinyl for shellac, and all of the red dyes that were laboratory synthesized dyes after the Second World War that seemed like substitutes for cochineal. But then two things happened. In the 1970s, there was the rise of an enterprise known as environmental toxicology. The understanding that many of these synthetic compounds produced in the laboratory that we were told were miracles were actually fundamentally toxic to the human body. And then secondly, the inadequacies of laboratory engineering to produce synthetic substitutes for materials like silk. As it turns out, Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Insects have been around for 480 million years of that. And the latest evidence suggests that we've only been around as modern Homo sapiens for 300,000. So insects have a leg up, or maybe I should say 4 legs up, since they're all 6-legged on us. And it's meant that they've been able to achieve certain things in their evolutionary time frame that we have not yet been able to achieve. And so silk, shellac, and cochineal have all experienced these profound resurgences in the modern era, to the point where they're in everything all the time, all around us. If you go into a grocery store, much of the fruit you see on those first produce aisles is coated in shellac. It's perfectly digestible, and it's certified by the USDA and the FDA as a food ingredient, and it's used to coat food to make it look shinier and to keep water in. When your kids go trick-or-treating at Halloween, they'll probably be eating 2 insect secretions if they're able to trick or treat during the pandemic. I should qualify that, but they may be eating candy that's dyed red with cochineal, which is perfectly safe for the body, unlike many of the carcinogenic chemicals that appeared after the Second World War. And the candy's all coated in shellac, which keeps it moist and shiny. If you take aspirin or Tylenol, you're eating an insect secretion because the enteric coating on those pills is shellac. I mean, who hasn't worn or seen silk? A silk necktie, a silk dress. These things are in us, around us at all times. And I think people often are simply unaware of the ubiquity of these products. And that's what really compelled me to pursue those 3 stories. There are other great insect commodities that are around us all the time, but things like honey are very important, but they've experienced a massive decline in the modern era based on the rise of sugarcane sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and have been replaced largely. And then I talk about iron gall ink, in which the Declaration of Independence and the Codex Sinaiticus, the first modern translation of the New Testament, are written, but that also has disappeared since the 1970s. Whereas these 3 that I talk about here are everywhere. And there's some really fascinating places that they're showing up as well, like, shellac is in dental implants. And I was being examined by my dentist at one point and asked to look at the bottle of what he was about to put into one of my fillings. And he was quite surprised that I wanted to know what the ingredients list was. And it turns out that indeed shellac was in there as part of the filler. And I'm thinking, okay, so now this insect secretion is going to be entering my mouth and becoming part of my body.
Right. So maybe we can take, shellac as an example, for folks who are maybe not familiar with how we actually get this kind of, coating, where does it actually come from? As an example of how insects are, involved or become involved in our everyday world. What is secreted? Like, how does the process actually happen?
Yeah. So shellac is the resinous secretion of the female Cariolaca bug, and these insects grow on the branches of fig and acacia trees in India and large parts of Southeast Asia. And millions of men and women make their daily living by raising these insects. And they then scrape the shellac secretion off of these branches, melt it down using a process that's hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and then break the dried, cooled shellac into fragments that are then sold to companies and melted down again. And they're used in everything. In embalming, for example, is one of the places in which lots of shellac is used, because it turns out formaldehyde is extremely toxic to the human body. And so people working with cadavers are much happier to be using shellac for the process. But shellac's also being used today in biodegradable electronics, and maybe the next generation of what will be in our computers. Because the things we're looking at each other on tonight produce a ton of what's called e-waste, and it's just accumulating mostly in the developing world in massive landfills. And to avoid that path, we need to be looking towards biodegradable electronics. And shellac can be used to make motherboards, and it actually decomposes because it's a product synthesized naturally. So yeah, the whole shellac was the hardest chapter to write in many ways because I knew so little about it. The fascinating earlier history is that 78 RPM records, which are really the first means of globally transmitting music, were made out of shellac. And that's why they have that sound of bacon sizzling in a frying pan. Is it's the brittle material from which they've been made and the deep grooves that had to be cut into a shellac record to capture the sound. But if you do get to hear that vintage sound of blues or jazz or an early classical concert being played on a shellac record, it's unmistakable. And part of the sound quality is imparted by the fact that this insect product is used in the making of the material itself.
I just want to note for folks who are on the call too, that in terms of just scale, right, you write that, especially in the early 20th century, that record production, audio record production drove the increasing demand for shellac. So in 1920, that the United States itself imported more than $23 million worth of shellac. That's in 1920 dollars. So 11,568 tons from Southeast Asia. I wonder if you could speak to that from the point of view of kind of commodity studies. How does it compare to, for example, rubber, which is something else, during this period that the United States is deriving from this part of the world. And is there a similar kind of power dynamic where, the United States is deriving these commodities, on the backs of and based on the knowledge of native peoples in these places, right? What are the issues and questions around power that we might pay attention to when it comes to the trade in and production of shellac?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. I mean, many of the commodities that I'm looking at here, especially silk, shellac, and cochineal, are produced essentially by small farmers, peasants, for lack of a better word, on the periphery, the edges of the world system. And that's so true, as you remarked, with rubber as well. And one of the fascinating things to that comparison, one of the fascinating elements of that is there's a botany to this as well. In other words, raising all three insects, the silkworm, the cochineal bug, and the shellac bug, and they are true bugs actually of the taxonomic order Hemiptera, requires an intimate knowledge of the plants on which those insects dine. And just like the rubber tree, you mentioned rubber, the cultivators who are producing all these raw materials that then tend to move towards the so-called global north, the developed world, have this intimate knowledge of the botany required to raise these insects as well. The silkworm dines on the mulberry tree, Morus alba, the white mulberry. And as I've said, the shellac bug dines on fig and acacia trees, and the cochineal insect dines on nopal cacti. So there's all of this knowledge embedded in these ancient systems that continues into the modern era, largely unchanged, because these raw materials are flowing towards these power centers, often at not tremendous economic gain for the individuals producing this stuff, but it's a daily livelihood, often for women in the developing world, non-timber forest products that can be sustainably harvested are part of their livelihood. So yeah, there's all sorts of intriguing stuff going on there as well.
Yeah. Well, why don't we maybe shift to talking about the second half of the book, and we'll do this to kind of give again folks on the call a sense of the kind of richness of both parts of the book, and want to dive into especially the chapter on eating bugs, to put it bluntly. Chapter 8, a six-legged menu, and I think that the point that I took away from this chapter, which I think maybe others on the call might be interested in too, is that you talk about how entomophagy, or the eating of insects, has been presented as potentially a solution to some of the environmental concerns, right? And this is something that we're picking up on that thread of the shellac as biodegradable material for computer hardware. So the idea that insects present a solution to some of our environmental concerns, and in this case through food production, you challenge that a little bit, in terms of looking to insects as a silver bullet for food production, which is very intensive in terms of the energy that it requires. How is that not? Help us understand how insects are not a silver bullet, and why we should be careful about thinking about insects as food sources.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I'll talk about their potential, because a lot of people are betting on insects. Bill Gates, Biz Stone, the co-founder of Twitter, Mark Cuban, whom some of our listeners may know from the show Shark Tank, who's a billionaire investor, they're putting all their money into house crickets. Because when you freeze dry and pulverize house crickets, you can turn them into high protein flour. And that stuff is in everything. Go on Amazon and search for cricket meal or cricket flour, and you'll find 80 to 100 products that you can buy, from brownie mix to stuff for baking pancakes, you name it, out of cricket flour. And the reason for this is that in the United States, it takes about 1,000 gallons of water and 2 acres of grazing land to produce 1 pound of beef. To produce 1 pound of crickets, it takes about 1 gallon of water and 2 cubic feet of space. And for that 1 pound of crickets, you get about 3 times the amount of protein, more iron, more vitamins. And so from an efficiency standpoint, we're moving towards a world by 2050 that will have 9 billion people. How do you feed everybody? And insects are certainly going to be part of the picture. I'm a little skeptical, though, of single solutions to complex problems. And I've kind of spent my whole career writing against, as you say, the silver bullet. There's some issues with scaling up cricket meal production. Some of the studies have shown that, well, when you start to do this at the industrial scale, there may be some fundamental systems that don't hold in place. And there's some issues politically with this. Will people actually agree to large-scale abandonment of red meat and instead begin eating insects? I talk a lot in the book about the cultural resistance in the West, in Europe and the United States, to entomophagy, which is the fancy term for, as you said, eating bugs. And so there's some big problems to be overcome. And I'm always skeptical as a professor in environmental studies of one-off solutions to very complex things that have all sorts of unintended consequences. But then I also did want to talk a little bit about the massive array of forecasters who are putting their money on insects as being at least a part of the solution for the future of food.
Right. I think maybe the cultural component of this also interests me because, as you talk in that chapter about, people all around the world for centuries, millennia maybe even, have eaten bugs, but there seems to be this kind of aversion, right, in kind of Euro-American, quote unquote, Western society against it. And you speculate on, some of the potential reasons why, that maybe at the, sort of the kind of the latitude at which people lived, that there weren't as many bugs, and so didn't develop as much of a diet that's based on it. But it's very clear that bug eating has become one of the ways that people identify others as savage or barbaric or weird or other. So I'm curious if you could maybe say a little bit more about how that cultural divide developed and how we might overcome it potentially, if it may play some part in the future of food production.
Yeah, yeah. The funny thing is how few people don't eat bugs on the planet. If you look at the absolute
Right.
numbers, 2 billion people right now are including bugs as central parts of their diets, and probably many, many more eating them occasionally, if not more than occasionally, as part of their diets. Almost every major culture has at least one, if not five, bug-centered dishes. You know, if you travel in Mexico, you invariably eat chapulines, which are fried grasshoppers, and they're delicious. They're coated in ample doses of chilies and lime, and they're crunchy. And now they're actually making inroads at many baseball parks in the United States. I talk about how at Safeco Field in Seattle, where the Seattle Mariners play, there have been several 100,000 servings of chapulines vended along with hot dogs and popcorn. But the big story about why the West doesn't want to eat insects has a lot to do with the whole matrix of things. You alluded to one of them, which is that the people who were the colonizers, for the most part, were coming from northern latitudes and not the tropics, where there are fewer insects. But there also is a connection between sort of this strange feeling we get in the West as seeing insects as something from the distant past and as something awful from the possible future. And I explore that a lot in terms of the way that Hollywood has created this disgust for insects with the insect supervillains of the 1950s films that then regenerate in various forms and iterations throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. So it's a really complex problem as to why folks in the United States and Europe have been less attuned to the rise of insect foods. But many people don't even know that you're actually eating insects all the time. I was just talking before we came on here about the fact that I'm drinking a cup of coffee, and the FDA allows 10% of green unroasted beans imported to the United States to be insect body parts. So, you know, you may be eating mandibles and forewings or drinking them without even knowing it. It's true in peanut butter and chocolate as well. So even if you're a committed vegetarian or vegan, you probably are consuming insects. And the last story I'll tell you is about several football players of mine who came into class one morning eating exo protein bars. And we had a good laugh when I pointed out that they should look at the ingredients list. Did they know there was cricket meal that was the protein supplement in the bars? And they looked down and hadn't realized that the exo in the brand is, of course, short for exoskeleton.
Right.
And it's a pair of guys who are Brown University grads who started a company, and all the protein is much more efficiently derived from cricket meal. And so the football team was inadvertently becoming entomophagists and didn't realize it. And they smiled about it and actually said it tasted pretty good. So it may be that we're overcoming these obstacles more quickly than we had initially thought. And pop culture has embraced the trend as well. I talk in the book about how Justin Timberlake, in his party for his new album Man of the Woods a couple of years ago, had the celebrity chef Rene Redzepi from the famous restaurant Noma in Copenhagen style his entirely insect-based menu with gold leaf and pouring honey on ants, and there were crickets and grasshoppers and mealworms featured at the party for the album release. So, you know, it may be that Timberlake is leading the way.
Well, I think it still doesn't beat, to me, what has to be the standout example of entomophagy in this chapter, which is the kazu marzu, which is this, and I hope nobody's eating dinner while they're listening to us, but this is a cheese that is literally rotten cheese that is a sheep's milk pecorino that is ripened with the help of flies who then lay their eggs, and the larvae, slowly kind of work their magic on the cheese after they eat it and then secrete it back out. And I just gotta say, I looked on YouTube to figure out what this thing looked like, and that was probably a bad idea. But
that's perhaps on the extreme end of the spectrum, yeah, in terms of the palate of our listeners.
Right. Justin Timberlake did not serve that at his premiere. Ted, let me ask you, just for folks to get a sense of the writing again, because it is so beautifully written, if you would consider just doing a quick reading from part of the book for us, maybe the epilogue, since I think that speaks so eloquently to some of the questions we've already talked about. Would you mind doing that for us?
I'd be delighted to. I'm just going to read a paragraph or two here just to give you a bit of the flavor of the writing. In the epilogue to the book, which is called Listening to Insects, I talk about both the figurative and literal act of being aware of what insects are telling us. What does it mean to listen to insects? The renowned English diarist Samuel Pepys recounted how his countryman, Robert Hooke, a natural philosopher, was, quote, able to tell how many strokes a fly makes with her wings, those flies that hum in their flying, by the note that answers in music during their flight, end quote. Indeed, Hooke's ability to recognize the distinctive pitches emanating from various airborne flies has been verified by subsequent research. Like a sonic fingerprint, the wing beat frequency of almost every species of flying insect leaves a unique acoustic trace. This one-of-a-kind buzz, hum, or drone reveals the creature's identity. In the field of human health, wing beat identification of insects has taken off as a way to detect the presence of disease-carrying mosquitoes. Using a sensor equipped with a laser beam, scientists can measure the wing beat frequency of minuscule airborne fauna to determine which insects are present in any given environment, from a savanna in Tanzania to a swamp in Louisiana. Undeniably, the whines and buzzes of bugs have been the harbingers of plagues and pestilence throughout human history. Nevertheless, in other times and places, their sonorous chirps, trills, and hums have been more pleasing to the ear. An ode to cicadas by the 1st century BCE Greek poet Melillo of Gadara artfully expresses this attitude. O shrill-voiced insect that with dewdrops sweet, inebriate, dost in the desert woodlands sing, perched in the spray top with indented feet, thy dusky body's echoing harp-like ring. Come, dear cicada, chip to all the grove, the nymphs and pan a new responsive strain, that I in the noontide sleep may steal from love, reclined beneath the dark overspreading plain.
Thanks for sharing that with us. I think before we turn over to folks who may have questions for you, I think maybe I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the people who appear in the book, and in particular to highlight some of the ones that folks may not be as familiar with. So certainly there are names that pop up that, folks who are into natural history or the history of science, like Charles Darwin, that are going to be kind of, all-stars that everybody's, will just immediately register. But there's some other folks who are involved in the history that you write that are less well known. And so I want to sort of maybe talk a little bit about them, and two people in particular stand out. Maria Sibila Marion, who you talk about as a Dutch naturalist who goes to Suriname, and Charles Henry Turner, who is somebody who is right here in the United States and overcomes some incredible odds to do groundbreaking research when it comes to the insect world. Tell us a little bit about these individuals and sort of the lesser known lights of this history.
Sure. Yeah, this was one of the most exciting parts of doing the work on this book, was uncovering stories that I knew very little about before undertaking the research. And Maria Sibila Marion, I'm glad you mentioned her, is absolutely fascinating. She's a name that should be a kitchen table name like Charles Darwin's name, but isn't yet. Fortunately, she's starting to gain a little bit of the acclaim that she deserves. She's kind of the great, I don't know how many greats we'd add to it, great-great-great-grandmother of entomology. And that's because in 1699, she departed from the Netherlands. She and her daughter Dorothea got on board a ship and by themselves sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the Dutch colony of Suriname. Suriname was a brutal sugar plantation state at that point where slavery was in full swing. It was an awful place from the vantage point of human suffering, but Maria went there on a purely scientific expedition. And hers was actually the first scientific expedition across the Atlantic done for non-commercial reasons. She funded the entire thing by selling 225 of her own paintings. And she and her daughter just got up and left and spent 3 years in Suriname, canoeing in dugout canoes into the heart of the colony and basically doing beautiful drawings and paintings of the flora and fauna they observed. And insects were really the focus of her studies. And she came back to Europe and eventually published a book of her illustrations, and they revolutionized the scientific world for 2 reasons. One of the things she did is she showed insects in their ecological context. For the first time, she showed these creatures on their host plants, eating, reproducing, and doing all the things of their daily lives on flowers and on leaves. Prior to this moment, it had been the tradition to show insects bereft of any context on a plain white background. You might think of the famous image that I put in the book of Albrecht Dürer's stag beetle from 1505, which is just a gigantic beetle on a blank white background. And Maria sort of put the nature back into nature illustration. And secondly, she showed all of the stages of the life cycle of these insects. Previously, many scientists had thought that those things we now know are stages were actually separate organisms going from larva to pupa to adult. And she began to help people understand that no, this is a process called metamorphosis. And so she's a really remarkable woman for her time and a remarkable scientist for any time. And I hope that she gets better known. Maybe I've contributed in some small part to that. And I find her story absolutely riveting, and I tell it in the book. The second individual you mentioned, Charles Henry Turner, is equally enthralling in terms of his biography. He was born in the late 19th century. He was the son of a Civil War soldier and a nurse, and he was African American. And he was the first Black man to be published in the journal Science, the first African American to get a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago, and he was unable to get employment in academia. No university would hire him because he was Black. And so he ended up working as a high school teacher. But what he ended up doing was he conducted a remarkable array of experiments on honeybees, and he did all of his experiments in a park in St. Louis. And he used very simple techniques, but he was the first to really demonstrate that bees were thinking, sentient beings capable of making independent decisions. They weren't just driven by instinct. And his work was foundational for our understanding of honeybees and pollination. And now today, if you think about it, 1 in every 3 bites of food that somebody on this planet takes is pollinated by an insect. And our understanding of that process owes a lot to this incredible African-American scientist who faced racial discrimination and persistent obstacles during his career, but managed to produce many of the early findings about how honeybees structured their daily routines and actually found their way to the flowers they would eventually pollinate.
I really did appreciate your sort of digging into both of these lives, and there's a moment of really just kind of, in some ways, sadness, that somebody of his talent, right, somebody of Charles Henry Turner's talent, was never able to perhaps reach as full of a potential as he might have with the full resources of something like the University of Chicago, but still amazing what he was able to do, right, as you write that he was a high school teacher, right, at Sumner High School in St. Louis.
And had no lab and no graduate students, but amazing. Still able to conduct this amazing array of experiments. Yeah.
Right. Well, so, I mean, before we turn to the questions, or at least open it up for a little bit of a Q&A, I want to sort of wrap up what our conversation has meant to me, which is, as somebody who doesn't, work very much on the history of science, and I got to say, after high school AP chemistry, I didn't take another science class. So this may have been the first exposure I've had really to, a scholarly study of science. in a couple of decades, that I really appreciated your not only revealing some of these hidden worlds to us, but also helping us understand how they're really enmeshed in, larger questions about gender, about race, about imperialism, that these are not sort of divorced worlds, but very much, as you argue in this book, intertwined together. So I really appreciate your, the research and the beautiful writing that you put into the Butterfly Effect.
Thank you. That's a real compliment. Yeah. I'm happy to take questions from the audience, and I don't know how that's going to be done, but have at
Well,
it.
if folks have, we don't have any questions yet. If folks have questions, they can feel free to write them and submit them in the chat, and I'll read them. I have a question though, or maybe a couple, possibly. But I'm curious. I mean, Ted, you've shared all these really fascinating anecdotes that I know are sort of woven into an overall argument, or when you're writing nonfiction books, you're trying to keep things in that are sort of working towards the message of the book, and so many of them are kind of stunning on their own. And I'm wondering, in the process of your research, this is just me looking for more weird bug factoids, if you can tell, but I'm just wondering if there are sort of stuff that you came across in your research that you couldn't fit into the architecture of the book, things you left out that would maybe be like cool deleted scenes for folks to know about, that maybe just were really fascinating, but you couldn't find a way into a chapter or to the thrust of the book itself.
Yeah, well, both the two people I talked about, Charles Henry Turner and Maria Sibila Mirian, deserve biographies on their own, and I started to write them, and then I had to cut back. So there's a lot on the cutting room floor that my editor has actually suggested could easily be turned into a biography of both of these individuals, and it was sad to have to let some of that go, but I wanted to give readers the setting, the context, the taste of their stories put within the larger narrative arc of the big picture that I'm trying to get at here, which is just how important, how ubiquitous insects are in our everyday lives, and how fundamental they've been to these institutions that we think of as so modern. And so I had to slim down both stories, and there's a lot of material there that could easily be made into a feature story for both of them. There are other people I wrote about here. Carl von Fritsch, whom I paired Charles Henry Turner's story with. He was born 20 years after Turner, but was a German scientist of Jewish descent who was persecuted mercilessly by the Nazis, but managed to give us the next generation of understanding about honeybees. And this kind of tale about insects as some sort of leveler, a universal equalizer that allows us to work with them without fancy lab equipment, without necessarily the apparatus of formal academia, is a story that I'd love to keep thinking about, because there's something there as well, the kind of plebeian history of entomology that's out there as well. It's kind of the every man's and every woman's science, and there's more to be done there, I think.
Have you heard from entomologists? And in addition to the public reception of your book, I'm curious to know what sort of like the insect specialists think about having our deep connection to bugs being sort of presented to commercial readers.
Well, that's a great question. I was on a call today with Mark Moffat, who's an entomologist. I quote him on page 27, in fact, and he gave me the thumbs up and said I had not made any major blunders in my scientific renderings, and that slowed my heart rate down tremendously. I had several former students who have gone on in entomology vet the contents of the book, and they were pleased and corrected things where I'd gone off the rails. But it was nice to hear from Mark Moffat, as a student of E.O. Wilson's and is extremely talented. He's been on many late night shows. He's known as the Bug Man. And if I'd gotten major things wrong, I think he would have called me on it. So far the feedback has been good, and I hope it continues that way.
I'm sorry if you and Ian already touched on this, but I'm wondering if I'm just thinking about our eco book club, which just met recently and talks about books as they relate to our environment and sustainability. And I'm wondering if You touch on it in the book, or if you're coming across and you're researching sort of the industrial scale with which insects make up a lot of our human infrastructure, the redounding effects of, hearing you talk about, especially about cricket meal, I'm wondering what are we just trading one runoff effect of mass industrialization of a animal byproduct for another? I mean, you mentioned the differences in water usage, but I'm curious if there are other things that you've noticed in your research about how these I think we kind of think about insects as being abundant sort of infinitely, but if there's if there's insect scarcity that we don't think about when it comes to these kind of questions.
Wonderful question. I mean, there's sort of two directions in which you could take it. Yes, insects are remarkably abundant. In fact, entomologists estimate that there are about 10 quintillion insects on the planet at this very moment. My 7-year-old and I wrote out that number, and there are 18 zeros after the 10. So we had to sort of swirl around on the page to get all those zeros in. So there are a lot of insects, yeah. But the other part of the story, and this is one I go into in quite some detail in the book, is that many are in real trouble. 40% of insect species are in decline and a third are endangered. And it's a direct result of the ways that we've been, and you brought it up, doing food production. We've been using chemicals and changing habitats in ways that really are destructive to these creatures that are fundamental to both pollination. You wouldn't have coffee, tea, blueberries, watermelons, almonds, you name it, without insects, and fundamental to the decay of organic matter, keeping the cycle of life going. And so they're both abundant and endangered simultaneously. And it's the process of conveying that story that's actually quite difficult, because as you're pointing out, there's something that seems kind of expendable when you swat a fly or step on an ant, but yet we don't often reflect on the fact that these creatures, without them, planetary collapse is ensured. And every major scientist will tell you that. It's not a controversial point. And so there's kind of an abundance and almost an insignificance, and yet a monumental significance to these creatures that I'm trying to convey here. And getting that all across is something I tried to do in the book. The funny thing about insects too is that most of what they do is kind of out of sight, out of mind, whether it's beneath our trash can or behind our refrigerator or under the blades of grass in our lawn, but yet they're everywhere. And they're doing all sorts of things that are really important to reconstituting the very basis of our existence on this planet. And I try to use poetry and literature and biography and stories about science as ways to inhabit that narrative.
Thank you. I think we're running up at the end of the hour here, so we're running short of time. But I have to ask to both of you the standard bookseller question. And I don't want to put you on the defensive, but I'm curious to know what you're reading and what you're enjoying right now. I know you're both in the middle of teaching on Zoom, no less. So time is pressed, and you may, like me, have bedside tables with just stacks of books collecting dust. But we can also curveball it to maybe what you're watching or listening to and enjoying right now. But if you have book recommendations for our audience, we'll certainly take them.
You go first, Ian.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll plug the book that I actually got from Literati earlier this summer, which I happen to just have with me on my table. It's Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning, which has made a lot of splashes this year as kind of the big Asian American book of choice, where she talks about the kind of experience of being an Asian American and the experience of feeling like you're being gaslighted in terms of your experiences of discrimination and racism. So I recommend that highly. It's being read very widely and read outside even of Asian American circles and Asian American studies, which is a really great testament to her writing and the power of her ideas.
Well, I've gone back to a more classic tome. I've been feeling a bit afloat during the pandemic, and so I'm reading Moby Dick, and my next book is actually about Moby Dick and Melville, and it's about the process by which that book became the great American novel, and was rediscovered. It only sold just over 3,000 copies during Melville's lifetime and virtually disappeared from the public view. And then in the 1920s, it was rediscovered and turned into one of the most important mainstays of American literature. And I'm trying to piece together that story as a historian who teaches about maritime history and the Pacific world, the peoples, cultures, and ecosystems of the Pacific Ocean. I'm trying to tell Melville's story through telling a Pacific tale. So I've gone back to Moby Dick in these times of quarantine, and it's taken me all sorts of fascinating places.
A perfect solitudinal book, to be sure, and one of certainly my favorite novel of all time, unabashedly. And Minor Feelings is definitely on the list, and I know it's a huge staff favorite at the store as well. So thank you for those recommendations, and thank you for joining us, Ian Shin and Edward Melillo. Thank you for being here and talking about this wonderful book. If you want to purchase it from Literati Bookstore, I'm putting the link one more time in the chat. To all of our guests, thank you for joining us at Home with Literati. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. And Ted and Ian, very soon we hope to have you physically back in the bookstore. I'd love to do this again for the Melville book.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Ian.